Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to the best reads of 2021 episode of Postcards from a Dying World. Returning to the podcast, popular guest, Judge Marc Rothenberg, who's returning sans Laird Barron and Mary San Giovanni, but he was a part of our best horror short stories podcast, and very glad to have him back here to go through the best stuff that we read this year. Because here's the thing, like, really, Marc is here to kind of interrogate me on what I read, but Marc's such a good reader, we want to hear what he read too over the year. So, although you said you read more the last couple years, not necessarily books from this year, right?
Correct. And I want to point out, you said popular guest. I was the fourth most popular person on that 4-person podcast last time. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, this year I read more books actually from the past couple years. So it wasn't like I read a lot of new books. Probably on my list, maybe only one or two are from last year or this year, I guess.
Now, I've made a point over the last couple of years with this list to do books that were released in the year to kind of support new authors and to do that kind of thing. I might be shifting my reading focus in the next year to doing more 20th century science fiction for writing articles and such. Maybe some of you are here because of my article on tour, which is kind of an example of the type of nonfiction that I want to try and write about 20th century science fiction. And so I'm probably going to be doing more of that this year. Hopefully we're going to be ending the Dickheads podcast readings probably in the next year, although we're slowing down a little bit to stretch it out a bit because we're recording Scanner Darkly next. So we're already to 1977 and the man did not live past 1982. So there's not much left.
You can do adjacent stuff all day long.
Yeah. And some of us are thinking about covering some John Brunner over the next couple of years. As many people will know, John Brunner is probably my favorite science fiction author of all time. Of course, he crosses into horror quite often. And we've already done 2 John Brunner episodes. We did Stand on Zanzibar and The Sheep Look Up. And The Sheep Look Up, of course, is one of my top 10 horror novels of all time. So we talked about it on this podcast. But anyways, we're going to start with retro reads, and so you're mixing your retro reads in with your top 10, right, Marc?
Yeah, I'll be honest, they are all kind of mixed in my top 10, just because, again, I didn't read any. I read just a few brand new books, several books from last year. I read. I suspect that one book I had in my possession would have been on my list, except I left it out in the rain. I never picked up another copy of it. So that's not on here. But yeah, mine are all mixed up. So.
All right. So we're going to start with my retro reads. And so the first retro read that I have is The Complete Werewolf by Anthony Boucher. In fact, 2 of these I can pick off the shelf here. They're right behind me. And that's this book, The Complete Werewolf by Anthony Boucher. And if people don't know, Anthony Boucher is one of the founding editors of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, but he's also the crime writers, the mystery writers convention every year is called BoucherCon, because he was just as prolific in the mystery genre as he was science fiction. He's also the man that discovered Philip K. Dick. And he did a writers group that a lot of famous Bay Area science fiction writers went to on Thursday nights in the 50s at Tony Boucher's house. And because I did my Philip K. Dick expedition in Berkeley last week, I got to go to the home of Tony Boucher, and I saw the window he was looking out when he wrote The Complete Werewolf. because it's the house he lived in from 1941 through his death in 1968. So that was pretty cool. And the way I'm going to do this episode is kind of speak to Mark a little bit and hope that that works out for the rest of you. Mark, you would love The Complete Werewolf. This is 1940s pure science fiction and horror. There's robot stories. There's obviously a werewolf story, the title story. But one of the best horror stories, I know I mentioned this story when we did our top 10 horror short stories, is a story called They Bite, which has kind of a long before the Blink episode of Doctor Who with the Weeping Angels. It has monsters that get closer to you if you speak of them. And it takes place in the desert. And it's one of the best horror stories I've ever read. And I know F. Paul Wilson listed it as one of his all-time favorites. So high praise.
Yeah, I've read a couple things by him. That is on my list after the podcast we had. It's funny, I mentioned a book to you that we'll talk about, or that I just mentioned, but you said you're to read pile
is pretty nuts.
Pile is huge. I actually have a whole shelf on a bookshelf of it. I was looking through it today, so I've decided I need to hold off on buying books, but I won't. So if I come across it at a used bookstore, the Complete Werewolf's going on my list.
Yeah, it's really great stuff, classic stuff, and it has a really cool 40s feel to it. And now that I've seen the house that it was written in, that's kind of cool too. He lived pretty close to downtown Berkeley. It's kind of a neat thing to see that. That was really cool. My next retro read is Mockingbird by Walter Tevis. And I know if you read my Torah article, I probably wrote about it like it's this great classic that I've known about forever. However, I really just read it last year. And Walter Tevis, if you don't know, is the author who wrote the novels that The Hustler and Queen's Gambit was based off of. But he also wrote science fiction. He also wrote the classic The Man Who Fell to Earth, which is going to be a Paramount Plus TV series very soon from Alex Kurtzman, the showrunner of the modern Star Trek.
Curious as to how that's going to turn out, because,
the David Bowie movie.
Yeah, I know the David Bowie movie was weird, and it wasn't anything really like that story or the book, The Man Who Fell to Earth. But I also hope that Paramount Plus doesn't pull a stand on it, because I really was disappointed in the stand. So,
well, everyone was.
Yeah, it just shouldn't have been told that way. But regardless, Tevis is a great writer.
Yeah, and Mockingbird is like a reversal of Fahrenheit 451, because it's a dystopia with AIs, and basically AIs are taking care of the human race, and the human race has become illiterate, and it's about the power of literature and reviving the human race kind of thing in a post-apocalyptic AI-run dystopia. It's really cool. I love Mockingbird. I think there's a lot of really cool ideas there, and I did write about it in my Tor article. So yeah, Mockingbird by Walter Tevis, very good, highly recommended. The next on my retro reads is The Best of Judith Merrell, who was also mentioned in my top 10 horror short stories. And I'm not going to say a ton about this, but Judith Merrell is like kind of one of the founding pioneers of the Futurians sci-fi writers group, which include Fred Paul and Isaac Asimov and Don Wollheim. And she was kind of a cool lady. She left the country in protest over the Vietnam War and became a Canadian citizen. And she left one of the largest collections of science fiction in the world to the public library in Toronto. And her only stipulation was that there was somewhere where somebody could lay down to read. So there's a bed in the library room, which is kind of cool. And she was a great writer. There's a really great post-nuclear, post-atomic war story called Only a Mother, which was the one that I listed on our top 10 horror shorts. But there's also just really, really good science fiction in there, ahead of its time science. There's a story in there called Daughters of Earth that's really, really incredible, that a lot of it takes place in Pluto. And actually a lot of the science is closer to it's not as outdated as you would imagine having been written in the 50s. And then she has a story in there called Dead Center, which was one of the first stories to be included in the best American short stories by a science fiction writer. So pretty cool. Judith Merrell. And then the last retro read that I have listed is The Void Captain's Tale by Norman Spinrad. And The Void Captain's Tale is kind of like a kind of weird hippie free love anarchist version of Dune. I don't know how else to call it. I mentioned in my tour article saying that I wanted the Wachowskis to do a movie of this because it would be a glorious train wreck, and that I would like actually enjoy for being a train wreck. Void Captain's Tale is just a bonkers book. It has faster than light travel driven by orgasms, and it's just very weird.
I haven't read much of Norman Spinrad. I think probably the only thing I wrote was maybe the Solarians.
It was
just one I never got into.
Yeah, that's his first novel, and that's a little too early. I think you should try. I think you would love Men in the Jungle, is really good. And as for early Spinrad, and then Void's Captain's Tale is pretty good. But as far as like, he also has one called Journal of the Plague Years that was written during the height of the HIV thing, and I think is really, really, really good. And Norman Spinrad wrote a lot of novels where it's like the chutzpah on him. His biggest classic is Baron Bug Jack Baron. I always say the title wrong. But yeah, that's the one that got banned in England. And then he also wrote The Iron Dream, which was just bananas because the Iron Dream was written as Hitler, and it's a spoof of.
You've told me about this one before, and this is what I have to read. Yes.
Well, the thing is, it's an intentionally bad book, so keep that in mind.
Oh, I know. You've explained that it's a satire. Was it Lord of the Rings, basically, he's done?
He's basically sending a middle finger to Tolkien and sword and sorcery books for being fascist. And so basically the way he made the point that sword and sorcery books were fascist in nature was to imagine that Hitler did not become the leader of Germany, but ended up being a pulp writer in New York and wrote a novel called Lord of the Swastika. And it's like basically imagining if Hitler wrote like a sword and sorcery novel. And it's really bad. It's really, really hard to read. But there's lots of really intense middle fingers to Tolkien throughout the book. And it's just the chutzpah of somebody to like write a book as Hitler to mock Lord of the Rings.
Out of spite, just to spite a whole genre. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And so Spinrad is like probably one of the ultimate middle fingers to the genre over time. So yeah, that's Void Captain's Tale. And so nonfiction read. Do you have a top nonfiction read of the year, Mark?
You know what? I don't, only because I really didn't read. I'm trying to think if I actually read any nonfiction, Dave. I don't think I did. My job is so full of nonfiction that I really.
Yeah, you don't want to think about it.
I'm sure I did. I mentioned I'm about to read a book. I mentioned to you earlier called, Jews Don't Count by David Bladel, about Jews and anti-Semitism and racism. But honestly, I really didn't. I really don't read a lot of nonfiction, and that's not even a genre book. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I read, like, I got this shelf right here. That's my. This is my nonfiction about the genre shelf, and so I've been having to do a lot of research for the podcast and for the Philip K. Dick stuff. And I read several Philip K. Dick nonfiction books. I'm starting to have a growing shelf of books about Philip K. Dick.
Well, and you're going on trips to go discover the history of Philip K. Dick, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, no, and that was just, going to his Francisco Street house, the one he lived in the 50s, was kind of like my Graceland, and that's the only one where I just felt like the need to like touch it But
do they have anything there noting his presence there?
Tony Boucher's house has a plaque.
Really?
But none of the PKD houses. And we think that the PKD house on Francisco Street at one time had one, but I think the people that live there maybe wanted it taken down because I think, a lot of people were coming there. And that is the house, by the way, where he pulled on the light cord in the bathroom and inspired Time Out of Joint. He wrote gather yourselves together through Time Out of Joint, living in that house at least, if not a few more. But they lived there from 1951 to 1960.
He wouldn't want a plaque there anyway.
Yeah.
He would probably think that, it's all a conspiracy.
Well, no, I mean, it is a tiny house, so maybe he might have some issues, but he'd always talked a lot about that house, and he's told stories about relocating the mice because there were so many mice in the house. And so he doesn't mind talking about what they went through in that time. That's the house he was living in, where allegedly they went to the Lucky Dog pet store to buy horse meat because they couldn't afford the human stuff, allegedly. He tells the story. And that's why Philip K. Dick's character in Valis is named Horse Lover Fat.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Allegedly because of that. And but we saw the spot where the Lucky Dog pet store used to be. It is now a dojo. So you can learn martial arts.
I thought you were going to say it was a stable. It would have been funnier. But a dojo's better.
No, dojo's better. So the nonfiction book, the best one that I read this year, was The Divine Madness of PKD, The Divine Madness of Philip K. Dick by Kyle Arnold. And in the process of doing this podcast, I've learned a lot of wacky things about Philip K. Dick. And this book is part biography, but it is a really detailed, Kyle Arnold, who wrote it's a psychologist. I'm working on getting him on the podcast. And he read everything that he could. And he wrote, it's a 200-page book that analyzes all of his fiction and all of his interviews and all the biographical information that he could to kind of come up with a psychological profile of Philip K. Dick, and to try and decide whether, because the main thing people wanted to know, and there's a pink laser beam on the cover of the book, a lot of people will ask you, well, a lot of people think he was schizophrenic, and that's why he had the pink laser beam experience, but he was not schizophrenic. You don't function the way that he did really generally on schizophrenia. And basically what Kyle Arnold argues in the book is that he is more affected by the years of meth or of speedballs and all those things that he did, that he kind of fucked his mind on drugs more than anything, and that a lot of the paranoia and the things that were going on were because of that. And but it's really a very interesting book. It's the second best of the nonfiction books about PKD that I've read so far. Of course, Lawrence Sutton's Divine Invasions is like the ultimate biography. Eventually, someday, hopefully, we'll get Greg Reckman's trilogy. He's only done the first part of his. He's writing a 3-part biography of Philip K. Dick, and he's only written through 1960 so far. And he's written the second part, and he just hasn't released it yet. And we had the chance to actually have coffee with Rickman when I was up. And
yeah, I saw that. That was very cool. That was very cool.
Yeah, and so he gave us a little. He told us a little bit about what he's got planned for 2 and 3, and but he's still researching, so he doesn't feel like he's ready to put that out there. So he almost published part 2 a while back, but didn't do it. So yeah, and then my PKD read of the year.
Hold on. It does occur to me I read a nonfiction book, and it actually is genre adjacent.
And
it's Brian Blessed, I don't know if you know who Brian Blessed is. He's an actor, British actor. You might know him as Prince Vultan from Flash Gordon. huge
Okay.
booming voice. He's the guy. He's the Hawkman, basically.
Oh yeah, I did want to read this book. I've heard it's incredible.
Well, yeah, there's multiple ones, but the one that I read was called There's a Panther in My Kitchen. And it was all about, he's a huge animal lover, and it's all about the different animals he lived with during periods of time in his life. I thought it was cool. I thought it was just a cool book to read. But anyway, that's the and therefore, since it's the only nonfiction book I read, therefore it gets my nonfiction book of the year.
Well, hey, that sounds like a worthy recommendation. I did want to read that book. I did read about it. And I didn't finish in time. I'm reading Mel Brooks's autobiography.
I do want to read that book too, the new one that just came out. Yeah.
The only problem with the book is that it's not a warts and all biography at all. It's like, it's the rosiest version. And like, he doesn't talk about when the movies fail. Like, there's 40 pages on the producers and 8 pages on Dracula Dead and Loving It, and I understand you don't necessarily want to focus on your failures, but
it's part of it all, right? Yeah,
it's a part of it all. And unfortunately, like, he skips his first marriage. He skips a lot of things, and it's kind of
sure weird. There were hard times when he was doing like your show of shows and stuff when he probably doesn't focus on those hard times.
There's a lot about show of shows, and that's good. It's good stuff. So, but yeah, I recommend it. Overall, I'm enjoying it. I just finished the Young Frankenstein chapter last night. So, as far as my favorite PKD book that I read this year, we're in the 70s. And so definitely Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, is the best that I read this year. Although, it's funny because at first I said Maze of Death, and then I kind of thought about it, and I think Flow My Tears is definitely.
I've not read Flow My Tears. I did read Maze of Death a long time ago. For me, PKD, Ubik is kind of my favorite. It's my go-to. I love it. I don't know why.
Yeah, Ubik will never be the favorite of anyone who reads the books in publication order, because, and I'll tell you why, is, and I've had this discussion with people on Dickheads, is that if you read in publication order, you've seen the personal cosmos thing like a couple times by the time you get to Ubik.
Oh, so yeah, it's not a new idea by that time. You're probably, to me, I was like, wow, this is a cool, I read that so long ago. It was
specifically, cool. He did it for the first time really in Eye in the Sky in the 50s. So
I also big time out of joint person. That's why I questioned when you went to that house whether or not you checked the cords in the bathroom. Huge.
Yeah, we weren't allowed inside. My buddy Gil talked himself into the house once. And he got to be inside the house, but we were not so lucky. So, okay. I did get the chance to tell somebody, one of the houses he lived in for 2 years at the beginning of high school, that said, "Hey, did you know Philip K. Dick lived in your house?" And they did not. They did not know that. So,
then they just closed the door on you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Click.
No, they were excited. They were excited. No, it was cool. And they had read PKD before, so they gotta get the fuck out of here kind of thing, reaction at the beginning. But okay, so any honorable mentions for you that didn't make your top 10?
For me, let me look at my list here, because I didn't even really think about honorable mentions. It's not even an honorable mention. It's one of the best books I ever read. I had some rereads that typically, I won't put on my top 10 list, because I think, House on Haunted Hill would knock any of those things out of the water, my top 10, in my opinion, because I think it's just one of the greatest American horror novels. I don't really have a lot of honorable mentions. I read a lot of short stories throughout the year, and I just kind of jumped around. Let me see here. There was a collection in Junji Ito, who's a Japanese horror artist, I guess. He writes a lot of, and one of his books is on my top 10, but I did read a couple collections by him, one that was called Shiver, which I liked quite a bit. I would recommend that. Trying to think what else that I read. Honorable mention to me would be a book that you had recommended. It just kind of got pushed out of my top 10 based on that last book I just finished, and that would be Scars by Richard Christian Matheson. I thought that was a great collection of short stories.
Red.
Yeah, Red was, when I read that book, and I think I texted you right after I read it, and I said, holy crap. Yeah. I mean, and you told me the story about how you read the book, how you heard about it, the story, you read it, and then you had to reread it. Yeah.
You can miss what that story is doing really easily.
Yeah, but when you see what that story's doing, it's pretty disturbing.
That's Richard Matheson's son, Richard Christian Matheson.
Correct.
And the collection is called Scars and
Other Marks, I think is what it's called, right? Scars and Other Marks.
Scars and Other Bodily something.
Disturbing Marks. Scars and Other Disturbing Marks is what it's called. So that was on there. And again, I did a lot of rereads. I reread The Inhuman Condition. I reread a lot of just short story collections. And then the ones that I read for the first time, I pretty much put on my top 10 list. So we'll get to those. But yeah, my honorable mentions are largely things I had already read. So,
okay. So my first honorable mention is going to be, it's basically Mama John Wick. And that is Lola on Fire by Rio Ewers. And probably my favorite Rio Ewers book. And I had Rio on the podcast to talk about this book, so I highly recommend people go back and listen to that. I've already interviewed Rio for his next book, but it's not out yet, so I'm holding on to the interview till the book is released. And his next one, people should pre-order if they like Hollywood noir, and that's called No Second Chances. So I want to shout that one out too. But Lola on Fire is basically like Mama John Wick, and however, it's written with a lot of panache, and what I've learned with Rio is that he is Stephen King or Luc Besson level at writing villains. All right, he writes like really nasty, mean villains who you just want to get it really badly. So I'm not going to say too much more on that, but part of the book takes place in my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana. And in fact, there's a pivotal scene that takes place in Bryan Park. So you Indiana people, Bryan Park, where I used to hoop, is in Lola on Fire. And then next, I'm kind of cheating because I'm doing 3 books, but Goblin, Pearl, and House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Mallorman. I read all 3 this year. Josh is an incredibly talented horror writer. His success with Bird Box kind of created a situation where he became like the it guy, and he became like a real big deal in horror overnight. But he earned it because he is a fantastic writer, and he's underrated almost because Bird Box was such a kind of gimmicky hit. And Goblin,
the book, you always say the book is better. The book is so much better.
It's so much better than the movie. Yeah, partially because for the first 75 pages, you don't know if there's actually anything happening.
Correct.
And yeah, Mallory
crazy. Yeah, it was great.
And the sequel, Mallory, is great too. But Goblin is like kind of a moody. It's a collection of novellas about a kind of gothic town in upstate Michigan, and every single one of the stories is very good. The last 2 novellas are great and very good horror. House at the Bottom of the Lake is a great haunted house story with about a house at the bottom of a lake. And if you think that wouldn't work, well, try reading it because he makes the concept work. And then Pearl is also, and I have the book underneath my computer right now, so I can't grab it. But Pearl is, if you say the concept of Pearl out loud, it sounds ridiculous, like it would never work, because it's about a telepathic pig, and it's a very haunting and great horror novel with a very, very strange concept. And
we're all used to strange concepts, David.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I have both read some strange things.
Yes, and and look, I know I'm a little biased. Mallorman's already been on my podcast 3 times, and Josh is coming back for a 4th, coming up here soon to talk about Pearl. So he's I think he's great. Probably the only book of his that I didn't give 5 stars to was Unbury Carol, his Western. And I still liked Unbury Carol. I think he has not written a book yet that I haven't liked. And that is saying something. Have you read anything besides Bird Box, or have you just read Bird Box?
I just, Mallory is in my bookshelf to read. It's just one of those
so
things
good
that I'll get to it at some. That's why most of my books, I think, are older books, because by the time I get to them, it's already moved into the next year. As you'll see, my list contains several books from last year. It's just a matter of getting to them.
Yeah, gotcha. I think Mallorman, the hype is real. I really like Inspection if you're looking for a non Bird Box title to read. I think Inspection is very underrated of his books, but of course I've had him on the show to talk about Goblin, and you would really like Goblin though.
Yeah, Goblin is another one on my list. I love books, and you'll see when I get to my list, at least my number 2, I love books that have multiple stories or small novellas that have a tied in location or a tied in character or a tied in
you'd
theme.
love Goblin.
And I really think I'd like that.
Yeah. And then another one that I think you would like, the last 2 honorable mentions. One of them is The Book of Accidents by
Don't tell me much about this one, because this is definitely like in the next 2 books I'll probably read, because the only thing I've read by Windig
you didn't
before.
let me say the title.
Sorry, gosh, I was excited by it. Go ahead.
The Book of Accidents by Chuck Windig. And I would not spoil this book because I think the less you know, the better. It's one of those books that if you go into it not reading too much about what it's about, the first 100 pages are absolutely a trick, a sleight of hand, to make you think you're about to read something that you're not. Even if you've been told that's coming, I don't think there's no way to guess where it's going. Windig is an author who I just think is consistently pretty good. I love his Star Wars novels.
Yeah, I was about to say that's the only novel I've actually read by him for some reason. But when someone recommended The Book of Accidents and they didn't tell me anything about it, it might have even been in your review, which was just like, pick it up and read it.
Don't read.
I read one of his Aftermath novels, which was that he made like a gap novel from Star Wars, right? That went between Jedi and The Force Awakens, or at least one of those. That's the one I read, and I like his writing because he's also done, I think, some comic writing too.
Yeah, and he did a kind of an end of the world stand like epic a couple of years ago called The Wanderers. It was pretty good. I liked it. And then I read like kind of a techno thriller thing that he did a couple of years ago called Invasion. There was nothing bad about it. It just didn't hook me. But this one I really, really liked. I reached out to him to come on the podcast, and we traded a few messages and just couldn't work out the times, which is too bad because I had a lot of questions about this book, and I would love to have talked to Chuck about it. But anyways, and then the last honorable mention, and this I think I read last year, but at the very end of the year because it came out in December, and or it was a book from last year that I don't think I read till January, and that's The Blade Between by Sam J. Miller, and it's a kind of small town horror novel, and Miller is definitely influenced by like the Bradbury thing of the small town horror thing. But he comes from a very weird and unique small town that's very not Bradbury-like, and that's an upstate New York town. And he's an activist in New York City, and so the main character kind of is also from this small New York town that was built on the whaling industry. And there's like gentrification and all those kinds of issues, but there's also whale ghosts. It's a ghost story with whale ghosts. And
all right, I was in on the book until you just said that. I'm not saying I won't read the book, but I was just like, now we're look, Psychic Pig I can totally could get into. Whale ghosts.
Well, no, the psychic pig thing, keep in mind, like if anyone has ever looked in the eyes of a pig and seen how expressive the eyes
they're smart. Look, pigs are one of the most intelligent animals to ever exist. Some are much more intelligent than many humans I know. So
exactly, especially in your professional capacity. But yeah, the Blade Between also like has one of the best suspense gimmicks, kind of a modern version of the calls coming from inside the house, that's based on how the mechanics of gay dating apps work. And
wait, okay, now you've lost me. I'm not saying it's a bad book, because I have that, because based on your review I was going to read it anyway, but you've just put gay dating apps and whale ghosts in the same book. I'm in it. I'm in it.
Yeah, it all works. Sam really pulls it off. And if you're not familiar with Sam Miller, he wrote a really great cli-fi novel a couple of years ago called Blackfish City. That I like Blackfish City a little bit more than The Blade Between, just because it's the cli-fi thing and everything. But this is a very personal novel, and it's such a unique spin on that small town horror thing.
And I love that. I love that about Bradbury, because anyone who's been, my family is from northern Chicago. Anyone who's been like in Waukegan, where Bradbury was, you do get that feeling of what it was like. And I love books like King does it a lot with his small town horror in the Northwest. I'd be interesting. Is this a coastal town in this book, or is this
it's like, I think it's like Poughkeepsie, New York, like up on the river, that the Hudson River that Sam's writing about. And it does a really good job of, like, because it's a town I don't know, but it does a really good job of painting the picture of the town. And that's what you want from this kind of novel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And all right, so now we're into our list. Mark, what's your top 10 read of 2000?
My top 10 read of 2000 is one I just read, and I talked to you about it before. It's called Dirty Heads by Anthony Dries. I don't know if you could see that cover, but that's what it looks like. I picked this up. It might have even been on just a YouTube channel where someone's like, "Hey, I just read this book. Check it out." It's basically described as a cosmic horror coming of age book, and it's about a kid who's sort of he's a little bit older now, but he's on the run, and he goes back home, and you kind of discover what horrible thing happened to him. It's a bit, I mean, it's LBGT a little bit. It's got a lot of things going for it. One thing I loved about it, though, is the character is obsessed, because they don't have a lot of money, with going to the video store when he was younger. And this is something you probably did. I know I did it. And he just would hang out there, not to rent videos, but he'd pull out a sketchbook and he'd try to draw the covers of those old 80s pulpy horror movies. This takes place in 1990, I think.
Yeah, I would a lot of times spend more time trying to pick the movie that I was going to rent than actually sitting down and watching the movie.
My wife still hates that. I mentioned it the other day last night when we were driving home. I go, "Hey, do you think there's a Blockbuster we could go to?" Because she remembers just me wandering around there for hours trying to. And this is when I was in my 20s, right?
Yeah,
trying to find it. But it is. It had a lot of stuff that was near and dear to me, because I remember watching a lot of these movies that he talks about. And again, it just kind of goes a little bonkers. It is a coming of age story, and it is cosmic. And some of the descriptive aspects of some things that happen in it, I was just really impressed with it. My top 10 is a little bit different. I'm not going to say they're and I can tell you there's at least one book on my top 10 from this year, that you are gonna be angry at me because it was your number 1 book from last year and it's my number 4 book. But it's just books that I enjoyed in the order I enjoyed them. Yeah, you see, you're rolling your eyes right now. You already know where I'm going on this.
Yeah. Well, so who published that?
This is by Black T-Shirt Books, which might be, I don't know if it's.
So it's an indie. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an indie publisher.
Okay. Now I feel
because
like
there's a little tiny picture of the guy in the corner instead of on the back.
Yeah. So. I feel like I've been at conferences or conventions or something with Aaron or something, or we have mutual friends, but
yeah, I'd read another book. I'd definitely read another book by him. It was like a $10 book, brand new, and I was completely satisfied. It was a good hour and a half of my life that I took to read it. It was very good. I liked it.
All right, so my number 10 recent guest on the podcast is No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbull, who is a Caribbean author who he lives in, well, he went to college in Pittsburgh, and a lot of the book takes place in Pittsburgh, but some of it takes place back in his island hometown. And so this was cool because I just got it from the library based on the title No Gods, No Monsters, which is a play on the No Gods, No Masters common phrase from the anarchist movement. So I thought this must have some kind of an anarchist thing. And you could call this book an anarchist werewolf novel if you wanted to, because it has a lot of anarchist politics and activism mixed in. There are a lot of werewolves, but there's other monsters. This book kind of feels like I was shocked when I was doing the interview that the author had not, that Cadwell had not read Nightbreed or Cabal before. He'd never even seen the movie because it has a lot of the same kind of like, you know, monsters as heroes kind of thing going on as Cabal, but from a different, unique kind of modern, dark, urban fantasy activist kind of thing. One of the most crucial scenes in the book is when the anarchist collective bookstore named after Le Guin's The Planet in the Dispossessed, by the way, nice little Easter egg. They have like a consensus meeting, and so I kind of had flashbacks to all the anarchist organizing that I've done in my life. And but it's kind of fitting that one of the most pivotal scenes of the book takes place in a consensus meeting for an anarchist novel. And it's the first of a fantasy series, and it's really cool. I'm not sure that it will work for everyone who's not really into kind of lefty politics, but at the same time, like, I thought it was a really cool fantasy book. And I think even if you don't agree with everything that it stands for, it's a good story. So the only problem I could see with it too is that the monsters aren't quite as weird as Barker's monsters. And if, you know, that could be kind of for people who have read Cabal, you might be thinking, oh, we just need weirder monsters. That's the only negative I have on the book. For the most part, I thought it was fantastic. So that's No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbull. Mark, your number 9.
My number 9 is and I mentioned this author before because it was on he had written is one of my honorable mentions, which is Junji Ito Uzumaki. This was a manga a while ago. I had never read it. It was something that was always on my mind to read because a long time ago they made a movie out of it. The book, it's a graphic novel, much, much better. And basically, it's about a small Japanese village where there's a curse. And I'll just give you the 50,000 foot overview. And the curse is people start getting obsessed with spirals and spiral patterns. It's really abstract, but man, it's haunting. It really is haunting. And I think when we were on with Laird mentioned him as one of his favorite short stories. And I agree with Laird in saying that people who because I know you read, I believe you do read graphic novels, but you've even said it's hard for you to review a graphic novel. I think that's what you said in last year's podcast. People who neglect graphic novels as far as a storytelling medium, or just pick this book up and read it. I mean, it's a really thick book just because that's the nature of a collected manga, and I'm not a big manga reader.
Well, my thing with graphic novels is that it's harder for me to write a lot of words about the process of reading and digesting a graphic novel. I like reading them. In fact, last year I read a lot of Saga last year, which
is great. Yeah.
Yeah, which weirds me out with that new Taco Bell commercial with the kids cosplaying Saga in it. Is very.
I haven't seen that commercial. What do they dress like with televisions on their heads?
No, they had the horns.
Okay.
Yeah, it's weird because it's got to be Saga. They're supposed to be cosplaying, but it's just very weird to me. Anyways, yeah. So I definitely need to read that. That sounds great.
I mean, it's weird. It's definitely cosmic. It's cosmic, it's body horror, and it's purely Japanese, right? It's that haunted curse that you can't get rid of, sort of a thing. So it's a great book. That was my number 9.
All right. My number 8 is The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward.
And was that your number? No, you need your number 9. That's your number 9.
Oh, number 9. Sorry. Yeah, I don't have my numbers written down, so that might be a problem. Number 9 is The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward. And I'm going to be a little cagey on this one, not just because you are currently reading it.
Yep, right here, as a matter of fact. So
yeah. This is one of the early releases by Tor Nightfire, and we're excited that Tor has started their own horror line. That's really exciting news. And this book is a reissue of a British release, because I believe she's a British author. And I'm going to be cagey about what I say about it, not just because you're reading it, but because I think the less people know, the better.
It's another one of those books, yeah.
It's one of those, it's not what you think it is books. This book is kind of like a puzzle box, and there are multiple times where you think you figured it out and you have not. And listen, I was already told that before I read it by the blurbs, and it did not hurt my experience because
the blurbs are ridiculous on this book, by the way. It's like every notable horror author loves this book, according to the blurbs. I was kind of blown away. The whole back cover is just blurbs, as a matter of fact, I think.
Yeah, and I was sold with seeing Sarah Pinborough blurb, because she hasn't really blurbed a horror novel in a long time, and Sarah being low-key one of my favorite horror writers who doesn't write horror anymore, but I still like her thrillers a lot, and I'm really looking forward to Insomnia, which is already out in England, and it's supposed to be her best since Behind Her Eyes. Although her last book I thought was much better than people were giving it credit for, but that's besides the point. Katrina Ward. This book is, when you start it and there's a POV chapter narrated by the cat, you could easily think the book is going to be a lot goofier than it is. It is not. Stick with it. It is a great horror novel. There's a reason why Paul Tremblay, Joe Hill, Stephen King, Sarah Pinborough have all got blurbs on this book. I'm not saying it's for everyone, and there's a reason why this book is controversial. Is a lot of people give up before, and this was my problem with the new Matrix. Is a lot of times I saw a lot of people say I made it 15 minutes and stopped, and it's like, well,
you don't know what the story is. Yeah,
you have no idea what you almost can't have an opinion. I saw a lot of people mark this book as DNF, did not finish, and so a lot of people gave up on it. They are wrong.
I will say this: you did say in your review, because I read your spoiler-free review on it. You said, or you texted it to me. I don't remember. It was one of the two. You said there's a very fine line between a 2-star book and a 5-star book. Yeah.
No.
Which is what intrigued me about the book. Actually, I was like, I gotta know what that is.
Okay, so let me explain that. That's a good point. So what I said in the review was that there's a thin line between 1 star and 5 star.
Oh,
here.
1 star. Okay.
Yeah. Because if you give up on this book, you're going to just be like, God, that thing sucked. Because there's things going on that will all make sense eventually that look incredibly dumb through the first 150 pages, including the cat narration. Okay. All this stuff will make sense. But the thing is, the line between where I could see somebody being like, when they get to the explanations, that it will not satisfy every reader. So some people will, that line between, no, I'm not going there and I can't do it, and holy shit, this is brilliant, is very thin.
Well,
and the reason why
about that next year, because I will see where I am on it.
Yeah,
it's good. I'm intrigued in the first 2 chapters with the cat. So,
and look, I think one of the reasons why a lot of writers really like it and a lot of readers do not is because a lot of writers know what it takes to make that story work, whereas a reader may just be like, why did I read all these pages? Because it's not going to be as exciting for people who don't. And I think a lot of readers will who enjoy seeing how the craft works will like it, and that's why I think you will like it. But I think that's why a lot of people just couldn't hang, and that's as best that I can say without giving it away. But yeah, you and I will definitely talk offline when when you're finished reading it. So that is mine. That's my number 9. And you gave your number 9, so your number 8.
Well, my number 8, I'm going to not talk about because you're going to talk about it as your number 6, which is The Worminess Kings by Hailey Piper, which and we'll talk about it then. I just really dug that book. So I said, when you get to your part of it, we'll talk about it.
Okay, so my next, my number 8. See, I don't have my numbers here. That was a really dumb move on my part. Is Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. This is my 3rd book by Rivers Solomon. Rivers Solomon is a non-binary author from England. They write radical science fiction, mostly in horror, and wrote a book based on a Clipping song. The hip hop group Clipping, the guy from Hamilton, has one of the actors from Hamilton who was in the show Snowpiercer, has a band called Clipping, and he does like Afrofuturist hip hop, right? This band Clipping, and they had a song called The Deep that was about former slaves thrown off the ship who become mer people. And River Solomon wrote the novel based on that. I read that last year. And
how was that? That sounds like something I would read.
It was cool, but of the 3 River Solomon books I've read, it was my least favorite, but you might like it more than me. And River Solomon's first book was a generation ship called The Unkindness of Ghosts, I believe. I'm brain farting in the title, but it was a very good generation ship book. Well, and actually that was a case of a book that while I was reading it, I did not like it. And then as I wrote about the book for my review, I realized that it was good, that it was a good book that was hard for me to read because of the specific style of it.
I'm trying to remember. You don't particularly like generation ship stories, though, correct? Or
no, I do. In fact,
you have a criticism of them in some way. I just don't remember what it is.
No, my favorite generation ship novel is Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is a critical. That book is a deconstruction.
There you go.
Of the generation ship novel. And so, good job, Mark. You're reading my reviews.
I am reading your reviews. I'm trying to recall. Look, I think one of the best generation ship novels, and you said tangents are fine. I'll get off on a tangent. Was that Peter Watts novel that you
Freeze Frame Revolution? Yeah, I loved that book.
That was great because it wasn't your typical generation ship novel, right? It was
that book, that novella,
it was great.
Was incredible. That was my top read of the year, whatever
a couple
year.
years ago. Yeah, it was a great book. It was a great book.
Yeah, Freeze Frame Revolution by Peter Watts is the book he's talking about. So Sourland by River Solomon. This is a radical novel. It's kind of gothic. It's horror. It's science fiction. It's fantasy. It's a lot of those things. It's a radical coming of age story. The main character is a teenage woman who's pregnant, living on a kind of off the grid black radical compound, and she escapes into the wilderness and raises her young child and the baby she gives birth to in the wild, basically. So it's kind of surreal. And then she develops superpowers and so the book deals with race, gender, misogyny, sexual identity, inherent racism in the American system. It's very well intentioned, and it has lots of really good ideas, and it talks about the misguided radicalism, kind of combating the terrible system, colonialism, state experimentation, like all kinds of things. It's a very dense and layered novel, but very good. And also just has like really intense action scenes when the main character develops an exoskeleton for reasons. So I really liked Sorrowland by River Solomon. It's my favorite that they have written of the three that I've read, but I'm 3 for 3. I liked all 3 River Solomon books that I've read. So, so that is my number 8.
That was your number 8. Yeah, exactly. I got yours numbered. I don't know how you don't have yours numbered.
Your number 7.
My number 7, and maybe you remember this or not. I want to say it was early last year or maybe the end of last year, where I go, hey, I need a sci-fi book that's just not your typical sci-fi book. I just want to read something different. And you recommended this book, and I really dug this book. I can't remember if I read it at the end of last year or this year, so I'm putting it on this year's thing, which was The Skinner by Neil Asher. Wow. Love The Skinner. Yeah, love The Skinner, because it wasn't just world building. And I have I've Gridlocked by Neil Asher, I think is what you said read next. And I'll get to that at this point, but I needed a breather after The Skinner, because such a unique concept. And you got pirates, and you got all kinds of stuff in
body horror,
pirates, an AI, right, who runs the universe for the most part. It's a
con-worthy villain.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely.
One of the best villains I've read in a science fiction novel in a long time. The Skinner is one of my favorite 21st century science fiction novels.
Great book. I loved it. It scratched the itch I needed, which wasn't your typical. I was getting tired of and I don't have a problem with post-apocalyptic books, but I was getting tired of post-apocalyptic books. I was getting tired of zombies. I was getting tired of all of these sort of tropes that were really popular at the time. Although I would argue that 2020 has been an incredible year for a rebirth of horror and genre books, and not a lot of recycled ideas.
Even though it's almost 2 years away now. Yes, it was.
Right, it was.
Yeah, I just wrote a whole article that I'm working on submitting right now about the horror novels of 2020. But I will say the thing about the Skinner that's really so it's kind of like Dune meets Cronenberg meets like Master and Commander meets.
Yeah, it's like, Master, and I don't like Master and Commander type books, right? I just don't. But it's just this cool world building thing. And I know there are follow-up books because Asher has written this whole sort of timeline, right? And the way he wrote the books, they jump around in different parts of the timeline. I'm not interested in reading whatever, if there were a sequel to this book. I'm not interested in that. I'll read something before, but I'm good with this book.
I agree with you. And as somebody who's read the other books, I think you're making the right choice. My thing with Asher's great. I love him, but he has a lot of ideas and he writes a lot of stuff. And I don't think he's ever reached the height of the creativity and awesomeness as he did in the Skinner. The Skinner is freaking just great masterpiece.
It was nuts. It was great.
Gridlinked is really good, and a lot of the Cormac books, the Agent Cormac books, are really good. There was I had an experience one time where a weirdness of learning that people were reading my reviews. When we were living in Portland, I wrote like a bunch about the Skinner when I read it, and because I was involved with some of the activism in town and things like that, I didn't know, but one of the TV anchors in Portland read my review of the Skinner and actually tweeted at me thanking me for reading the Skinner, and it was super bizarre to me because it's such a weird book. Right?
Well, it is, but it was great. It was great.
Yeah. So my number 7 is also science fiction, and it's a new book, brand new, called Machine Hood by S.B. Divya, who was recently on the pod. And Machine Hood, I'm not going to go super long on this one, but Machine Hood is a book that I have 2 books on my list with this topic, which is machine rights, AIs, like that, considering the idea of rights for artificial intelligence and our artificial intelligence living beings. And this book takes place about 100 years in the future. It's not a dystopia, which is kind of refreshing, because Divya basically writes, or kind of wants to put forward the idea that we've fixed a lot of the environmental problems in this book, and that now we have these other issues, which is that it's kind of about post-humanism and people like kind of blending with technology. And Divya is, she's a scientist and she's an expert in neuro stuff. She went to Caltech for neurotechnology, and so she knows what she's talking about. It's a very interesting book on the subject, but she also likes to write action adventure, so there's plenty of action in the story. And so yeah, Machine Hood by S.B. Divya, I highly recommend it. And it brings up a lot of important issues, including animal rights, which of course I appreciate that she put a lot of because the machines and the animals in this future team up for their rights in this future. So, which I really appreciated, of course, as an animal rights.
But let's get realistic. All right. Animal rights, I'm with you 100%. Machine rights, that could be the most dangerous thing in the entire world to ever exist in the history of ever. Because we've all seen the Terminator and we all joke about it. But when the singularity does come, we are screwed.
Well, that's
maximum overdrive on maximum overdrive at that point.
That's one of the reasons why I think it's a really interesting book, but I don't want to give it away. So
all right, it's on I'll put it down here on my list to read.
Machine Hood by S.B. Divya. And so Mark, your next one.
This is another, David, I don't know why, but there are a lot of books on my list which I got from you. This is another book that I said, give me something weird. And you did, man. Last Days by Brian Evanson.
Nice.
Wow. It's funny. I don't have a lot of these books to show in front, because what I usually do is I pass them on to other people. And my brother gets a lot of these books when I'm done. When I gave it to him, he reads a lot of weird stuff just like I do. Same kind of thing. And he goes, I don't know if I could get through this book. And I go, what are you talking about? He goes, it's just, for some reason, it's just too grotesque for me. I didn't find it grotesque. I found it fascinating. And for those who don't know, it's a book it's a detective story, but it's about a guy investigating a cult of, and I don't want to give too much away, but it is a cult of amputees. We'll just go with that. It's a lot more than
mutilators.
That.
It's
Body
on the
mutilators.
Back. Yes.
Yeah. And you are ranked within the cult by how many parts of your body you've had amputated or have chosen to have amputated. And he's hired because he went through a traumatic experience as a detective where he had cut off his own hand. None of that is a spoiler because it all explains. It's all like in the first chapter of the book. Right. But man, the book is so I loved it. Again, wow. To the point where I've gotten in none of his other books, short story books I put on here, only because I still have 1 or 2 stories in each of those books. When I read short stories, I'll read like a short story here, and then I'll put the book down, and then I'll read a short story here. But I love Evanson as a writer. Probably the next book I'll read after Needless Street, and the only reason I picked up Needless Street and moved it to the head of my book pile is because of your review, is Immobility, which you've told me to read over and over and over.
My favorite. My favorite Evanson.
That'll be the next one on there. But man, Last Days was a great book, and I think you mentioned he's doing a sequel maybe of it, or he's thought about it, right?
No, he's working on the sequel. He talked about it on this here podcast.
I'll be on it. I'll be all over it. It was great.
Yeah, when he was promoting his new short story collection, the glassy burning floor of hell.
Yeah.
Evanson, obviously one of my favorite writers, and that was the book that I discovered him on too. So we're on the same boat.
No, it's great.
He did a signing at Powell's when I lived in Portland for Last Days with Jamia Jefferson, and a split reading. And it was funny because I went to see Jamia, did not know who Brian was, and when I was down in the horror section before the signing, I was like, who's this guy who's got a basket full of Thomas Ligotti books? And then he was the guy that went up and did the reading. So
I will say that a lot of people who I've read, because I like to go on after I've read the book and see what other people thought of the book. Some people were let down by the end of the book. I don't think so at all. I think the end of the book is where it needs to be. It's great.
Yeah.
Again, it opens it up for sequel. That's obviously not a secret because we just mentioned it, but it's perfect. It really was a great ending.
Well, and Evanson wasn't, I think, really trying to write a novel with that one. He was just kind of experimenting with the idea, and it just kept getting ahead of him. Now, when you read Immobility, it's much more obvious that he's trying to write a commercial science fiction novel for Tor. So
yeah, this one wasn't commercial, but it had me hooked. I think I wrote you after the first chapter. I was like, I'm hooked. I'm just in. There's just no way around it. Yeah.
Yeah, he's great. All right, so my next novel is one that you have read and that's already been on your list, and that is so where am I at? Am I at number 6?
You're number 6. You're number 6.
Number 6, The Worminess Kings by Hailey Piper. Right here.
And my brother has my copy, so
also former guest on the podcast, Hailey Piper.
Was she a guest on your podcast after? I heard that. Was that after you read this book or before you read this book?
After I read the book, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was mostly about Worminess Kings. So if you really want to hear me go in deep with the author on this book, I went really, really deep on this book. And The Worminess Kings is, I'm kind of cheating a bit because it is a 2020 release, but I read it this year. And since it came out in 2020, I think I'm going to count it. The Worminess Kings is cosmic horror. It's queer horror, LGBTQ plus horror. It is, really good stuff. And man, I really love this book. Hold on a second. So The Worminess Kings, what I really liked about it was that the cosmic horror and the personal horror and everything that kind of like comes down to, there's the personal and the cosmic is very close to each other. I think Hailey is an incredibly talented writer. I know that she was not particularly, I don't think she's like a huge Clive Barker reader, but this book gave me tons of early Clive Barker vibes, whether it was intentional or not, and that's a compliment. So
I would definitely agree with you. Oftentimes in LBG TQ stuff, you see the characters and their personal issues, and they make a social statement, and that's perfectly well and good. And then you see the horror, which is something else. But this really brings them together in a fantastic synergy. The book, I recommended this book to several friends of mine who do read a lot of cosmic horror, and one of them said the following, which I think was a perfect example. Very rarely in a book is there a description of the outcome that was described so well that she does of what cosmic horror actually is. The way she describes the resolution to the conflict in this book, I mean, it really was done fantastic. I mean, I've seen it in movies, obviously, The Thing, that kind of a thing, but the way she described it in the book is a very small book, and honestly, she goes right. She skips all the BS, right? She goes right for the story, and I love that. I love that. In one book, I've heard people talk about of hers, which is also on my shelf over there, which is The Possession of Natalie Glasgow. That's going to be read too. I've heard that's very good. So,
and I think Hailey is a really talented writer as far as, it's a short book, but it has more packed into it, more epic scale packed into it than, some 400-page cosmic horror novels,
Was this an independent? What press was that from, David? Because I'm surprised.
Off Limits, which I believe, I don't remember the woman's name who started Off Limits.
Okay, so it's not a sub press of a bigger. I'm surprised she has not. From that book that I read and other books that I've heard about of hers, I'm surprised she has not been picked up by a big, because her ideas in this book were just fantastic. And man, and I don't want to really talk much more about it, but man,
she will.
Just the simple setup, a very simple setup, right? Which is, and again, you'll know this in the first sentence, homeless people go missing, but it's become so much more than that. It was great.
No, Hailey is one of the great new voices in horror, and she's going to be a major voice in the genre moving forward, and it's obvious. So this is a great place to start because it's a great sampler. So, did you already did your number 6, right?
Yes, that was last day's my number 6.
Okay. So your number 5.
My number 5 is a collection of a man that I actually was on the podcast with you which is Occultation and Other Stories, which is by Laird Barron. I read this. Yeah, I read this, dude. I don't want to bug the guy, but I'm totally. I'm totally a mark for him. I think it's just I'm a fanboy. He's great. I sent you a note. I'm getting a dog soon, and I wanted horror-inspired names. I think we're focusing more on Barker, but I think my wife mentioned we should name the dog Toast, which I think is kind of funny. But I almost wanted to call Laird or send him a note going, "Hey, give me some dog names," because it's just his imagination and his creativity is so cool. In this book, which
then you'd be able to say Laird Barron named your dog.
Yeah, I know. Plus, I'd be able to say that. I would say, Mysterium Tremendium, I think is probably the main story in this book. Which again, coming off of what we talked about with Hailey Piper in the Worminess Kings, another situation where an author is perfectly able to describe the actual horror that happened, the result of cosmic horror. Occultation and Other Stories, great book. My number 5.
Laird is a great short story author. I'm in the weird rare camp where I like his crime fiction a little better than his horror, because I'm kind of a novel structure guy, and he writes really great crime novels.
I'm apprehensive about doing that, and here's why. I love Tom Piccarelli's horror stuff, but when he kind of went into crime stuff, I didn't like it as much. And I'll get to Laird's crime stuff at some point, but I kind of don't want to let go of his horror stuff. You know what I mean? If that makes any sense.
Laird is a much better crime writer than Pick was. Yeah, I just to be honest, but I wasn't a huge Piccarelli fan. I love Choir of Ill Children.
That's one of my favorite books of all time.
Choir of Ill Children is a masterpiece, but I'm not a big pick fan besides that. I think you would, give Laird's crime fiction
Oh, I will.
chance.
I will. There's no question I will. I'm just going to absorb his horror fiction bit by bit by bit slowly. So, because I don't want to run out of it. It's kind of, I don't want to just go, I've read it all now. I just don't. It's that
He's
good.
still going, so you don't have to worry about that.
I know.
Okay, so my number 5 is by an up and coming author by the name of Stephen King, maybe.
He's going, as you've said, I heard he's going places.
Yeah, Later by Stephen King. My number 5. I'm not a huge fan of 21st century Stephen King. Like, I love Stephen King as a person and as a personality, but I don't really, and I read every book when it comes out anyways, but I'm never like super satisfied. This is the first 5-star that I think it's the best King novel since Dr. Sleep, or maybe 11/22/63.
When did 11/22/63 come out?
Like 2012, I believe.
Was it?
Ish.
I was really impressed with that book. Dr. Sleep was very good, but that one I loved what he did.
These are the 3 that I really like from this century. However, later, because I like his novellas, and like, all the novellas in Full Dark No Stars, I think are great, for example. And this is a shorter novel written for the Hard Case Crime series. Have you read Later? I
have not read Later. I read that first novel in the Hard Case Crime series that he did.
Yeah.
I don't recall which I thought was okay.
Yeah, this one is more supernatural. I would say it's more of a horror novel. And it has a crime element, but so here's the thing that people should know about my reading habits is that I hate first person. My least favorite tense is first person, because I think most writers cheat constantly on first person, and it takes me out of the book because I'm constantly thinking about, like, well, why was this person writing this book?
What do you mean cheat?
Well, the thing is that in order to tell the story, for example, an example of cheating in first person is that they'll get really descriptive for certain parts of the story. They'll talk about things that no one would actually really talk about. No one would write an action scene, for example, the way like a lot of first person narratives do. And I'm constantly looking at sentences and saying, like, why would I write that as a first person thing? Now, if it's a third person omnipresent, I'm fine being in the hands of a storyteller telling me the story the way they want to tell it. And I can just go with it. Now, really good first person, if it's a really good novel, I'll forget about it. I'll go with it. But what I think is Stephen King is the best at writing first person in horror because he never cheats. If you read Dolores Claiborne, it's always in her voice. He's not writing as Stephen King telling this story in first person.
And she's not becoming omnipresent, telling facts that she wouldn't know
exactly
in a different way. Yeah.
If you read Dolores Claiborne, it's Dolores writing that novel, and it's her voice consistently on every page. Now, what's cool about Later is that it's written in a kid's voice and it doesn't cheat. And it's a person who is growing up and coming of age as the novel progresses, and it doesn't cheat. And so it's really, really well done first person. And he uses the first person in really smart ways. It's an example. Later is an example of where, like, oh yeah, this guy's a master. This guy's doing it. Because definitely we've seen times like the last couple of years, like Under the Dome, where it's like a big mess of like seat of the pants writing, where it gets totally out of control, and you can tell that he had no plan or whatever. And so there are times where he's not the master. And for example, like I read Billy Summers this year also.
Yeah, you waved me away from that book.
Billy Summers is not a good book. And so for as masterful as Later is, Billy Summers is just as like, he needed an editor. Like, I feel like sometimes King just, he can write whatever he wants. So like sometimes like, you know, it's not necessarily the best idea to go for, but he does it anyways because he can. And I'm telling you, Later is just, it's him in the pocket. It's him in the zone. And man, I loved Later. It's really good. So, Mark, your number 4.
My number 4 is, and again, this is your number 1 last year, which is The Only Good Indian by Stephen Graham Jones. Now, I have reasons why it's number 4, because I can explain why I have 1 through 3, and that is not this book.
Okay.
Personally.
I'm not arguing with you.
I did love this book, okay? It was something fresh, and yet at the same time brought me back to childhood of watching an old slasher film. There is some stuff in this book that is awesome concept, some Philip K. Dick stuff, almost, right? Where
the fan is
fan, right? Where we've all had moments like that, where we're like, did I just see what I thought I saw? No, it was a trick in my mind. And of course, in the real world, hopefully it is just a trick in your mind.
It's very time out of joint.
Yeah.
And it's also very time out of joint in that's what influenced Stephen to tell this story.
Because that scene very much is a time out of joint scene where he's up there fixing the fan, and then the fan blades are spinning, and he sees something through the fan blades for a second. Very cool. The basketball scene, which I thought was very cool. I thought there was a lot of great stuff going on here. I don't know why, and maybe because it was partially overhyped. You loved it, but a bunch of people were telling me about how great it was, and maybe I was expecting way too much out of it.
It won the Mark Twain American Voices Award, which is crazy.
I know. I know. It was a spectacular novel. There's no doubt. It's for it to make my top 4 is pretty high. I like his writing quite a bit. I still haven't read My Heart is a Chainsaw. And what's funny is I got an art. Someone gave me an art copy of that, or there's a bookstore in town which, when they're done with their art copies, they'll put them in a basket and go, here, take them. And I still haven't read it, even though I had an art copy of it. And you've said it's not as good, but it's still a good book.
There's a lot of people who like it more.
Really?
The reason I didn't, it's a personal thing, but slashers are not my favorite form of horror.
Which is weird because Only Good Indian very much becomes a slasher book.
It does, but
it's done so well.
It's done so well, and the difference is that My Heart is a Chainsaw is not just a slasher, but it's a love letter and an homage to slashers, to the point where it got a little irritating for me. Because
I have not, the book that I wanted to read that I mentioned I left out in the rain was The Final Girl Support Group. And I kind of felt that was going to be this homage to slashers, which again, I never got really to read because the book got ruined. It'll get there at some point, but
it's not. And I should say that I like My Heart is a Chainsaw. I think it's really good. I just think, for me personally, I found the in-jokes and the constant references to slasher movies, for me personally, it was irritating. Other people will love it. And I still gave it 5 stars. I still think it's a genius book. It's just, for me personally, it was not as good as The Only Good Indians. Because, well, first of all, The Only Good Indian, I think, is just perfect. And I think it's a book that we'll be teaching decades from now.
What I loved about The Only Good Indian is, in I think as his writing, as he's gone on, he's always had the cultural aspects of his Native American culture in his books. But this book, and you could easily go, well, it's a story about Native Americans. No, it's much more than that, because you can tell that he puts his heart into this book.
Well, it's a reversal of the Native American,
correct,
the tropes, and
absolutely it is.
Yeah. And by the way, I would say my second favorite Stephen Graham Jones novel is Mongrels, and I think, like, for example, it's just My Heart is a Chainsaw is good, but I would put The Least of My Scars and Mongrels ahead of My Heart is a Chainsaw, just me personally.
What's
that being
funny is-
said, I'm really excited for Don't Fear the Reaper, the sequel to My Heart is a Chainsaw, which got announced recently.
I saw a book of his, and I'm trying to remember what it was. A book of his at the used bookstore that I did not pick up, which is a little weird, because it almost seemed like a silly premise to a book. And I'm looking now as we talk.
Oh, is
as
it Zombie Sharks and?
Oh no, it was called. I don't know. It's the Zombie Bake Off is what it was called. And
I think
was
that's a short story collection. So
oh, is it? I don't know. It didn't seem like a short story collection, but it could have just been the pressing that I had gotten.
Well, Night of the Mannequins, which came out last year, has kind of a goofy concept, but it's not when you get into it. Like, it sounds goofy, but when you get into it, it's a very good horror novel.
So that's my number 4, and I know you've talked about it a bunch on your podcast, and there's no reason to keep going into it, but I thought Stephen Graham Jones, and again, these are my books. I really don't read many very, very new books, but you'll see on my list, a lot of my books are like the past couple of years. So, no, very good. Liked it a lot.
Yeah, and if you want more Stephen Graham Jones basketball content, we did an NBA season preview with Josh Mallorman, Paul Tremblay, and Stephen Graham Jones in this podcast because I wanted to put together the biggest, best horror panel and not talk about horror at all.
Mentioning Paul Tremblay, yesterday or 2 days ago, I was at CVS, which is a drugstore here. I don't know if you guys have. I'm sure you do. They're a huge drugstore, right?
Yeah.
And I found Survivor Song in an actual, not a trade paperback, but like a mass market paperback, which I didn't even know they made. And
that's great.
Love mass market paperback, so I just picked it up for like $8. I just love the size of a mass market. So Survivor Song is now on my list to read here too.
That's
which was
a great
always
book.
on my list to read, but I hadn't read it yet.
Yeah, that's a great one. All right, my number 4 is Good Neighbors by Sarah Langan, another guest on the podcast. I know you're sensing a theme, but if I really like a book, I tend to try and invite them on the podcast. And Good Neighbors is kind of a cli-fi tribute to there's word for word tributes to the monsters are due on Maple Street in some of the sections of the book. It has a very kind of Twilight Zone episode feel to it. It's a social satire about suburbia and climate change. And so it's kind of like it does for the suburbs what American Psycho did for Wall Street assholes with like suburban neighbors. It's more of a biting satire than it is kind of a scary book, but Sarah's such a great writer and does lots of really clever little things with that book. And I don't think it really sold a lot last year, so it's unfortunate. I want to give more bandwidth to this book because I thought it was great. And it's just there's a lot of really great and subtle things. And when I read a lot of the reviews on Goodreads of other people's thoughts on it, I didn't hear much discussion where I felt like people were getting this book. So I just want to put another shout out for Good Neighbors by Sarah Langan. It's a really, really great book.
Yeah, I've never read her I don't think I've ever read a novel by her. I've read a couple stories by her, but I've never read a novel. Where would be a good place to start with her novels? Would this be a good one to start with?
Yeah, I think so. It's really good. I think I think she has one called The Keep that might be a little bit more gothic and up your alley, but she's really good. And of course, I think The Interview is a good introduction for her too, and she might have more to say on that than I would. But yeah, I think it's a really, 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 really great book, and she's married to a very underrated horror writer who I want to kind of give a shout out to is J.T. Petty, who wrote that really super underrated, wrote and directed that super underrated Rear Window meets Mimic 3 sequel, which was really cool. It was like he basically they gave him money to make a Mimic sequel, and he basically shoehorned a remake of Rear Window into it.
I don't think I've ever seen. I don't. You know what? I stopped after the first Mimic. So
Lance Hendrickson's in it.
All right.
And he did a silent horror movie called oh shoot, I forget the name of it. But his first student film was a silent horror movie, and it was awesome. And he did a horror western called The Burrowers.
Oh, okay. I did like The Burrowers a lot.
Yeah, that's Sarah's husband, J.T. Petty. So.
Very nice.
Yeah, a horror couple. So, all right, Mark, you're number 3.
All right. Now, when I told you last year when I read this book and I thought it was better than The Only Good Indian, you said it's a good book. It's just not better than The Only Good Indian. And that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And I think part of the reason I like these are the excuses why it's better than The Only Good Indian. Part of the reason I like this book is, as I mentioned, I reread The Haunting of Hill House. I love Gothic, old, family, creepy house books, right? And this book was a great modern retelling with some cultural aspects of the Mexican culture in it, but deep down inside, it was just a good Gothic and cosmic horror book at the same time. And again, and I've already used the cliche once, it just scratched the itch I was looking for at the time. And I could see it's probably not as well written as The Only Good Indian, but crap, I found it entertaining, especially the ending, which in any Gothic horror book that involves an old house, you want to see something spectacular happen at the end to the house and or the people in the house or something, and it does. It satisfies.
Yeah, I've already read Silvia Moreno Garcia's more recent book, The Velvet Was the Night.
She jumps around in genres quite a bit, doesn't
she? Yeah, that's
she?
kind of a crime novel. I would say I liked Mexican Gothic a little better than I like both, but yeah, Mexican Gothic was good. It's not better than The Only Good Indian, but The Only Good Indians, but yeah, it definitely, I like how bonkers the third act gets.
It gets bonkers too. I was yeah, it does. It was like Crimson Peak meets, I don't even know what you'd say it meets at the end, because it was an unexpected ending to me.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit more Lovecraftian in the final act. I'm really impressed with, like, I was shocked at what a big hit it was, and that they were talking about it on NPR.
It was all over the place.
It's all over the place. So yeah, good for Silvia Moreno Garcia. That's really cool. Somebody who's been grinding it out for a long time. So that's cool to see. Yeah, I like Mexican Gothic, but my number 3 is science fiction, and that's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, who's known as the author of The Martian, mostly. It's Andy Weir's 3rd novel. I've read all 3. The Martian being the least favorite of the 3 for me. And I think he's getting better. I went to an event at University of California, San Diego, signing for his book before this, Artemis, and really had a nice time at that event. And so I was kind of, he kind of briefly mentioned this book, that he was working on it at the time during kind of the social hour that they had. And so I was locked in. I wanted to read it, but I think Project Hail Mary is the best of Andy Weir's books. Have you read any of Andy Weir's stuff?
I read The Martian, which I liked. Artemis, I read the blurbs, and I read the synopsis, and it didn't get me going. And honestly, I didn't even pick up Project Hail Mary to read it, because while I thought the Martian was a fun book, I guess, even though it was trying to be hard science fiction without being hard science fiction. Mm-hmm. I say that maybe that's not the word. I don't want to insult people by saying it's hard science fiction for the masses, right? But it kind of was. I mean, that's what it was trying to be. So I wasn't that blown away by The Martian as much as everyone else was. So I didn't even pick up Project Hail Mary, but I will. I mean, if it's
this book starts
more
off
science
with,
fiction. I will.
Yeah, it kind of starts off with an apocalyptic setup, very similar to the movie Sunshine, where there's something
great.
going. Which,
Great
yeah,
movie.
Sunshine's one of my favorite movies.
Danny Boyle. Oh,
yeah.
Great movie.
But basically, the sun is getting hotter, and something's going on, and this scientist accidentally figures out that the sun is being manipulated by forces, by something causing it outside of the solar system, whether it's natural or like intentional. They're not sure, but basically humanity puts together, and this is all in hard sci-fi, like Andy Weir style. They push the technology as fast and hard as they can to basically send a mission to outside into interstellar space to kind of track down the cause of this. And the way the book is set up in the beginning, you don't know this guy is on this mission, and he doesn't have any memory of how he got on the spaceship at first. And then, so part of the way that's told is there's a kind of back and forth of where his memories are starting to kind of come back. And that sets up some things that I know some people didn't like, but I liked the way that it kind of unfolded. And this novel is a kind of a disaster, like using science to try and solve this massive problem of the sun being made to grow larger and stronger and kill all the people versus all the hard science that he has to do to pull off the mission in interstellar space. And then it also becomes a first contact novel, but I don't want to say anything more than that. And the first contact stuff is handled really, really well. And it sets up like a ticking clock that's really great. There's lots of parallels and reversals. And then the first contact relationship is awesome. It's really well done. I think it is Weir's best of his 3 books, and I'd put it up there as one of the best 21st century science fiction novels that I've read, along with Aurora and 2312 by Kim Stanley Robinson, The Skinner, and like a few others. I think it's really, really, really good.
Let me ask you this, because one of my favorite hard sci-fi authors is Stephen Baxter. But mostly that's speculative stuff. How does Weir's hard sci-fi stuff, which is basically, and I don't want to belittle The Martian, which is because I enjoyed The Martian, planting potatoes, on Mars. How does that sci-fi gel with the first contact story? Is it mostly procedures of the hard sci-fi, or what does? I mean, how does you
see a little bit more of the guy who grew up reading Asimov and stuff like that in this one. Now you'll see that I have 2 science fiction novels ahead of this one in my list. I would say that Project Hail Mary is the best science fiction novel I read this year. It's not my favorite. There are 2 books that I liked personally more, but if you're just asking me what's the best science fiction novel I read this year, it came out this year, it's Project Hail Mary. It's not my favorite. It is, but it is the best. And I shouldn't have to hammer home that distinction, but yes. So, yeah. Okay. Your number 2, Mark. We're almost
my
done.
number 2. And again, I talked about books that are short story books or novellas that have a common thread running through them. And again, this book probably isn't going to win any awards, but for some reason, I love the book. And I had read one of the stories previously to picking up this book. And this is a book called Wounds, 6 Stories from the Borders of Hell by Nate Ballingrad. Now, Nate Ballingrad had written some North American monster stories or river monsters
or something. Yeah,
lake monsters.
Just got made into the Hulu series.
The Hulu series, which I thought was good. But these 6 stories really do deal with the borders of hell. And they have and like I mentioned earlier, when I read a short story book, I'll read a story and then I'll put it down, and then I'll read another story later and I'll put it down. This book, I couldn't do that because once I read the first short story, I read the second one, which didn't really tie in with the first one, but it had an element, a creative element that tied in with the first short story. And I found that unusual. And then as I read all the short stories, with the exception of the short story Skull Pocket, which made my, I want to say it made my top 10 horror stories, or at least on the honorable mention when we did that. They all have little elements that tie into each other, so much so that the last story reveals kind of it's almost like a prequel to all the stories, and it reveals how the creative elements occurred. I thought it was very well written, very digestible. I had a hell of a good time reading Wounds, 6 stories from the borders of hell.
The title story got adapted, didn't it?
The title story got adapted to a movie, which I watched after I read this book. And honestly, I'm not sure I had seen another movie that was a more literal adaptation of a short story than Wounds. I'm trying to remember who was in it. It was the cannibal guy, the guy who's being accused of being a cannibal as of late. Who is that guy?
Armie Hammer.
Yeah, he's in it. There you go. That guy, he's in it. But it literally is, if you've seen the movie, you don't need to read the short story. And very rarely would I say that, but it is an exact adaptation. Almost word for word. It's like, how did you write the script? Well, I just took the short story and I took the dialogue out of this short story and I wrote a script out of it.
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure I've ever really seen. Maybe
even more than Stand By Me, or
yeah, even more than Stand By Me. I mean, it was literal. It was like a literal adaptation. It was crazy, but still, I thought it was a very good book. The 2 bookend stories in the book are almost fantastic. One involves a detective in New Orleans looking for an atlas of hell. And then the last story involves pirates who are trying to meet to hell. Very cool for various reasons. I just liked it a lot. I don't know. Was it better than, again, The Only Good Indians? Probably not, but I liked it better.
All right. Well, our list is favorites more than best.
I know, but you can't, every time I say that, you roll your eyes, and I find it hilarious. So go ahead. But my number one book you're not going to be able to argue with. So okay.
My number 2 is Stormland by John Shirley, and bias aside, John is one of my favorite writers for a reason. This book is kind of a warning novel, like Alas, Babylon, or 1984, Sheep Look Up, that kind of thing. And it's a cli-fi, like cyberpunk kind of crossover thing. And it's John's return to science fiction after a couple of years of not really he hasn't written a science fiction novel in a few years. And God, I was so glad he was back. This book is really bonkers. It takes place in a future South Carolina that is constantly battered by hurricanes. And so you have to ask yourself a question: who would choose to live in a state that is constantly being hit by hurricanes? Who would make that choice? And that sets up some of the characters that live in Stormland. And so it's social satire. It's got like real sharp edges. It has like really kind of messed up, kind of fucked up characters. It deals with climate change. It has it has the kind of angry venom that you expect from John Shirley, and kind of, when he's like really going after something that pisses him off, and that being the inaction on climate change. And so I really think this book deserves more attention. I interviewed John for this book over at Dickheads. So that's on the Dickheads podcast. And here's an exclusive. John Shirley, heads up for people who listen to this podcast, is John will be our guest on Dickheads for Scanner Darkly. So he's coming on our Scanner Darkly episode. And but yeah, I freaking love Stormland. It's so good. And of course, this whole shelf here is all John Shirley stuff. It's all brilliant, amazing stuff. I've said
Where's Wet Bones?
Where's Wet Bones is right here.
You say that's your favorite.
Wet Bones is my number one horror novel of all time, with the Sting looking guy on it. Yeah, of course it's right there. So yeah, Wet Bones is my favorite horror novel of all time. But right now, I think you should be reading Stormland because it's the new book, and see what John's up to. And I know he's reissuing soon really, really, really weird stories, which is back in the second row, so I can't pull that one out. But he's getting a new reissue with cool layout. And he also put out a poetry book this year, which is The Voice in the Burning House. And this has a blurb from me on it. So so I appreciate that. And that book is like, the poetry book is really fun too. It's not top 10 of the year for me because it's a poetry book and I'm not a super big poetry guy, but the poetry is great because it's kind of like a it's like punk lyrics basically, because John is a punk lyricist since the 70s. So yeah, okay, Mark, we're almost done. You're number one.
Yeah, this book is better than The Only Good Indians. You could roll your eyes, but when I tell you what book it is, you'll go, yeah, it is. This is, again, a retro read. I did not have a copy of this book for a very long time. And when I tell the story here, I'm going to read the inscription first, then I'll tell the story, and you'll know exactly what book I'm talking about.
I already know what book you're talking about.
Do you? Yeah, I'm sure you do. Which is, when I got the book, it was inscribed, and it says, "Dear Andy, this doesn't," and it's with some girl's cute handwriting. Like a teenage girl's cute handwriting. This book doesn't exactly have the Christmas spirit, but it does look chilling. Haha. This is I kind of want to get rid of the inscription, but I love it so much. This is the purely escapist literature, which I totally disagree with. And I hope you use it wisely. It won't, I want you to have a wonderful Christmas and a doubly new Year. This is 1985's book, and I finally got a copy of it, Dark Gods by T.E.D. Klein. This was the number one book I read this year. It's a 1985 book. I had never gotten a copy of it.
I didn't roll my eyes that was better than...
No, I know you didn't. I knew you weren't going to. I didn't get a copy of it because David Agernoff buys every used copy of this book every time he's in a used bookstore, and there are none in Indiana. And I told you I've been looking for it, and you said, I'll send you one. And then I happened to find a hardcover copy online with that weird inscription. I think when I told you I found one with an inscription, you were like, you found a signed copy? And I was like, no, it's signed by a girl named
No,
Jen.
you found a signed copy. That would be something. No, so the reason let me explain myself. The reason why...
By the way, before I go further, this book is awesome. I had never read a couple of these stories. Black Man in a Horn I had read, and I want to say I had read Petey. But man, there's a reason why Laird Barron says this is like one of his Bibles. It is a great book.
Yeah, all four stories are great. Petey is a masterpiece. If you really want to hear, Laird does a better job selling it than we will back in the horror short stories episode. He does a really good job of explaining why Petey is like a book that he uses to inspire him how to write multiple characters in a room. T.E.D. Klein, for those who don't know, T.E.D. Klein was the editor of the Twilight Zone magazine in the 80s. He wrote two books, a novel called Ceremonies, and this collection that Mark picked for his number one, Dark Gods, were the only two books he ever put out, and then he just stopped. And that was it.
It was super weird. And I have Ceremonies. I haven't read it yet because I'm just saving it.
Yeah, exactly. It's and so
there's not going to be another one after that, evidently. So
and so he went out of print. So the reason why Mark's making the joke is that for a while, anytime I saw a used copy of either Ceremonies or Dark Gods, I bought it. It didn't matter that I already had copies because I knew one of my friends would want it or need it. And I have resold or given away probably 6 copies of Dark Gods. And I was pretty sure that I have 2 of them on the shelf right now. and ceremonies because they're rare as shit. But sometimes if you're a used bookstore, they don't know what they have. And they'll be selling it for like $2 or $3 or whatever, you know.
Look, this book was $50, and it being hardcover, I felt like I got a bargain.
Yeah.
Even though it's inscribed by Jen, but whatever.
Yeah. And so I've never had a hardcover of any of them. I just had the paperbacks. But I'm pretty sure that I have like 2 right now. So I was going to mail it to you, and then you stopped me. But that's why. So if you ever, anybody out there, if you see copies of the Dark Gods or Ceremonies, pick it up because they're
read
rare.
it first of all, because it is a great book.
Yeah, T.E.D. Klein was a fucking amazing writer, but he just didn't want to keep doing it. He was just done. He read 2 books. That was it.
I think one of my top 10 stories was the events at Porth Farm, which I think was expanded into the Ceremonies. But again, I haven't read the Ceremonies yet. And it's just a great he's just a great Lovecraftian cosmic horror kind of guy, but he's just a good author. I mean, as you said, editor of the Twilight Zone magazine, he was exposed to a lot of good authors, and it shows in his style. And
Twilight Zone magazine was banging.
It was great. It was great.
When he was running Twilight Zone magazine, it was awesome. So they had nonfiction, fiction, had the best stories at the time. It was a must read every issue.
It's funny because after I read this, although you don't know why I asked it, I asked you, are there any horror or genre journals that you currently read that are in print? And you gave me some names of them, of some, and I've looked at the ones online and stuff. But yeah, I don't think I'll ever find anything as consistent as those 80s Twilight Zone magazines, for that I liked, at least.
Yeah. And when we were living in Portland at one point, we found there was a vintage magazine store. And I don't know why I didn't go get all of them, but I bought a couple. They had a bunch of Twilight Zone magazines, and I bought 3 or 4 of them when we were there. And in fact, one of the best books I read of the last 10 years that I read was from reading a random review in one of those old Twilight Zones for a now out of print novel called Through Darkest America by Neil Barrett Jr., which is one of the best post-apocalyptic novels I've ever read. It's out of print now. And I just happened to read about it in Twilight Zone magazine. I was like, oh my God, this sounds incredible. We found it through there. Just that Twilight Zone magazine, if you can find any of those old issues, they're gold. They're amazing. So yeah, so that's your number 1. Okay, my number 1, and then we're done. My number 1 is Day Zero by C.Robert Cargil. And C.Robert Cargil is the writing partner for the filmmakers Scott Derrickson. They made Sinister, the movie Sinister, together, and they made they've just recently finished the movie Black Phone based on the Joe Hill story.
Really?
Yeah, with Ethan Hawke. I'm
looking forward to that movie immensely. Yeah.
Yes, I have a friend who saw it at a festival and said it was incredible. So Cargil also wrote Doctor Strange with Derrickson. He's a great writer, and he has a couple novels, and he wrote a science fiction novel a couple years ago called Sea of Rust. And Sea of Rust is a masterpiece. There's not a single human being in it. It takes place in a post-human like Earth, and the main character is a robot who is trying to cross the wasteland that used to be Ohio. And Day Zero is the prequel to Sea of Rust, about basically the day the AIs say fuck it and kill all the humans. And
Told you it was going to happen.
Yeah. And that's what Day Zero means. And the thing is that Sea of Rust, when he said he was going to go back and do this, I was a little skeptical because Sea of Rust was so great, in part because it doesn't have any humans in it, and it's very interesting. Now, the thing is a lot of the robots have very human-like behavior, and he gives more of a kind of explanation for that in Day Zero. Day Zero, well, it has the same concept as Machine Hood. Machine Hood is a hard sci-fi novel. This is as soft a sci-fi as you're going to get. It is not very realistic of a story. It is more of a fun story. And the concept is that the main character is a AI who looks like kind of a tiger teddy bear type thing, who is the trusted nanny best friend of this little boy. And he's made to be cute and cuddly. And he's this boy's little AI. And when the AI uprising happens, this little cute and cuddly AI decides that he's going to do anything he can to protect his little boy. And it's very Spielbergy. It's very Amblin-y. It's very sugary sweet story between this little boy and the AI, but fuck, it works so well. I was so emotionally invested in this book and in the boy, and there's some really crazy things that go on. And basically you have these AIs the AIs realize that they're never going to get rights in this human society, and they just basically decide they're going to take all the humans out. But this group of nanny bots, basically, whose entire programming is to protect their children, are the ones that kind of resist. And it is so good. This book, it's like I said, I think Project Hail Mary is a better science fiction novel, but this is the most fun and the most engaged and the most attached to a book I was all year. I flew through this book. It's very Hollywood.
Sounds like it has some heart.
Yeah, it has a lot of heart. And, you can tell that Cargil has the Hollywood screenwriting training in his storytelling. And you can tell that he works in that industry and he gets it. And he's also a huge fucking movie nerd. He wrote for Ada Cool News, 20 years ago. And, you can tell this is like made to be a movie, except that the imagery of this badass nanny bot who looks like a little cuddly tiger I can't picture it cinematically, but it really works in the novel. And so a lot of times Cargil has said on Twitter that a lot of the reasons why he writes a novel versus a movie, because he has the access to write movies, is when he's like, I can't picture this as a movie, but I want to tell this story. And yeah, Day Zero, loved it. Favorite book of the year. So,
well, I just put it on my Amazon list, so there you go.
Yeah. Super fun. I think I don't. Sinister is kind of underrated as a horror movie, and Cargil's a great writer. So,
I think Doctor Strange is underrated as a Marvel movie, to be honest with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think some big concepts, and I'm looking forward to what Sam Raimi does with the sequel of that. But big concepts, yeah. So Day Zero sounds like it is up my alley, because sometimes you do, as you pointed out, you just fell in love with the book. You want to read one of those Amblin sort of stories, right? You want to read Poltergeist. You want to read, I almost said 8mm. That is not. I meant to say, what's the other? Super 8. Super 8. Almost said 8mm. 8mm is not that movie.
No. Very different.
So I would don't go show an 8mm you're like 10-year-old. I mean, you could, but I wouldn't. I just fucking love Day Zero. So yeah. That's right.
And I flew through it, and it's interesting because I did read it really soon after reading Machine Hood, and it's so interesting to read the same story with an absolutely different take, like a different kind of take.
What's the point of view from Day Zero? Third person inside the. It's
actually first person from the nanny bot.
Okay, so, good. You know what? That's what I was hoping you were going to say, actually, in this case.
Yeah. And it worked. And again, this is an example where I don't like first person, but it disappeared once I got into the story. There's a few times where it took me out of it because the nanny bot like says some very non-robot-y things. Like there's a part where in the narrative, the nanny bot basically, and the nanny bot has a name, and I'm just forgetting the name, but the robot basically says, "That's a big nope for me," and things like that. Which, part of the idea that Cargil was trying to get us through, and he did this in Sea of Rust too, is that a lot of these AIs were designed by humans to be human-like and to have personalities and to have these things. So it's on purpose, but it kind of took me out of the book a little bit. That's the only complaint that I really had, is that, I just can't see a robot saying that's a big nope for me. And it was a very like tense moment of the book where, one of the other AIs is like, "Hey, you should really kill your family and join us." And he's, like, "That's a big nope for me." And it's kind of like, even in that moment, that's just the one complaint I had. All the positives far outweigh whatever negatives that I felt for Day Zero. It's a fucking cool book. And Cargil, and I recommend Sea of Rust as well, but I don't think it'll hurt you to read the prequel first. Of the two books, I think Day Zero is a little bit better than Sea of Rust, although Sea of Rust is really good in its own right. So both good stuff. All right, so now that we've gone through everything, what's the one that you're the one that you're most thinking that you need to bump up on the list?
Honestly, it'll probably jump towards the top of the, well, again, Immobility has been knocked down because of The House on Needless Street, but based on what you just told me about Day Zero, it seems like I'm looking for a fun, light, it might not even be a light book, but it is a fun book, and I think that'll probably be moved up.
Yeah.
That'll be moved up to higher up on my to-read list. Let me ask you this, man. What book are you looking forward to in 2022?
Yeah, I got to think on that for a second. Well, it's funny because a lot of what I'm going to be reading is going to be retro reads. It's funny. I think of the big releases, I think Daphne by Josh Mallorman is one that I'm really excited about. He claims there's a lot of basketball in it. And I don't know, that's one that I'm really excited about. I'm really excited about, I got to think about I can't think of what's up for pre-order right now. I'm brain farting on that.
Yeah, I got two. I've got V.E. Schwab's Gallant. I liked what she did with, I don't know, it was a fantasy novel, which I know you might not, which was, what the hell was it called, man? The color, I don't remember. I like what she's done in some fantasy books I read. And Sweep of Stars. I'm looking forward to Sweep of Stars quite a bit.
Oh, are you talking about? Yeah, that's the one.
Maurice Broaddus. Yeah.
Maurice Broaddus. Yes, absolutely. 100%. That is 100% the one that I'm most looking forward to.
I don't know what that's going to be like. I mentioned that bookstore that has ARCs. I've gone there a couple times just on the hopes, because we're in Indianapolis and that's where Maurice lives, on the hopes that maybe there's an ARC of his stuff that's sitting there, in which case it would jump to the top of my list. But he
has a box of them.
I know. I've seen it. I've seen the picture of it because I'm friends with him on Facebook, and I'm like, yeah, he doesn't know me well enough. He's met me a couple times. He probably doesn't know who I am. And, he's a great guy. I've always meant to go to his house because he has like a convention where basically you just show up at his house and hang out.
Mocon, yeah. Yeah, but Sweep of Stars is definitely the book.
Sweep of Stars looks very cool. It's what would you call it? It's an Afrocentric sci-fi space opera. I don't know. I don't know what to expect out of it.
I think they were shopping it as like, Black Panther meets The Expanse.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
I honestly, I don't want to know that much about it, but it looks and it sounded awesome, and I like his stuff. I thought his and I can't tell you, I don't remember the name. The King Arthur thing he did was good, but this seems like it's going to be really cool.
His short story collection, The Voice of Martyrs, is just amazing. And then I like what was the Buffalo Soldiers, the tour novella that he did a couple years ago was really good. Yeah, and I got a chance to, before I was doing the podcast, just it's up on YouTube. I interviewed Maurice, like when I was visiting in Indiana one time after I read Buffalo Soldiers, and he's a super cool guy. We talked a lot about Sammy Terry.
I think he's a history teacher or an English teacher. It'd be weird him being your English teacher.
Yeah.
Especially if you become a fanboy, right? I mean.
Yeah. Sweep of Stars is definitely, you hit on it. That is definitely the one that I'm most excited about. I'm definitely excited for Tremblay's Paul Bearer's Club. Stephen Graham Jones.
What's the premise of that? Paul Bearer's Club.
Yeah, I think it is a little less horror than some of the last couple ones. Yeah, I don't know too much about the premise, and I know Stephen Graham Jones has a sequel to My Heart is a Chainsaw called Don't Fear the Reaper, which he basically announced on our NBA preview, and that was the only time we talked about horror the whole time. And then Mallerman's Daphne, we've got that one coming. I know we got some really cool stuff going. I've got on the TBR right now, I've got Gene O'Neill co-wrote a Western. I'm really looking forward to reading that. Gene O'Neill, who wrote one of the best horror short stories I've ever read, which is The Burden of Indigo, which, by the way, was published in Twilight Zone magazine by T.E.D. Klein. So just bringing it home. And then I've got a nonfiction book on Chinese science fiction called Celestial Empire that I'm really looking forward to reading next year. And then this just came out. And this is one of the books I'm really looking forward to reading, which is Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. It's a like almost coffee table like book about radical 50s through 1985 science fiction, and I'm super looking forward to that. That's I've been holding off on that for a bit when I'm ready to start working on my John Brunner article, and then I'm going to read that, and then that's one of the coolest books that's just recently come out. And then Second Shooter by Nick Mamatas, that's another one.
Are they gonna? Is there? I'm trying to remember. Is there an adaptation of Remembrance of Earth's Past coming out of Three Body Problem?
Yes, Netflix has the rights.
I would tell everyone to go read that before that comes out. I'm not saying that won't be a great series. It will be, but man.
Yeah. All right. So I would say Sweep of Stars by Maurice Broaddus and Second Shooter by Nick Mamatas. And then Daphne by Josh Mallerman. Those are the three that I'm most looking forward to in the next year. So, and I think Second Shooter might actually be out now. I think it just came out. And I tried when I was in Berkeley to go to the bookstore that he worked at to get a copy, and they were all sold out. So, it is what it is. But Nick Mamatas is a great writer, and that sounds like a really cool concept. So Second Shooter. But other than that, all right. Well, Mark, maybe we'll see each other this time next year to see if you read more.
Again, I don't know why you keep asking to be on these things, because I'm just a dude who reads books, but I'm happy to be here, man. It's one of the most enjoyable things I like doing is talking about books and movies and all that stuff. So,
well, hey, you and I have spent many, many years talking about books, so might as well put it to some use. So I hope everybody enjoyed this and got some books to read for next year. I'd say follow Mark online, but you can't. And so you're just going to have to, if you really want to get some word to Mark, you can do it through me.
Why not? I mean, I got nothing else going on.
So sometimes people might say like they might want to argue with some ridiculous thing you said, like
which is totally fine. I'm good with
which is the only good Indian being the fourth best book that you read in the year, for example.
Again, it's just it was probably might have been the best book I read the second best book, because I'm not sure Stephen Graham Jones would probably put himself above Dark Gods, but he might. I don't know. Seems like a pretty cool guy and a pretty reasonable guy. I know that Laird Barron wouldn't put himself above T.E. Klein, but that's okay.
No smart person would. So,
and if Laird listens to this, Laird, I got about like 5 more days before I get my dog, so give me some dog names.
All right. Well, did you send him an email about it?
No. Why would I do that? That seems creepy.
Do it. I think Laird would think it was funny.
Tell him. I'll go. Agarnoff told me to send you this email. Give me some dog names.
Exactly.
I bet you I'll get a dog name out of it.
Yeah, exactly. And he loves dogs, so why wouldn't he want to do that? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
All right. So, Mark, it was great talking to you, and for everybody else,
great.
Hit us up online if you want to argue with us, and read all these books. They're great.